This video is going to cover three very important case studies that help us understand sort of all the different components of memory and what models we think explain them, as well as one that actually kind of goes against our current model of memory. But along with these, I have a couple of YouTube videos because I can't show you someone else's YouTube video in my own video. So I've linked those on our eClass page. They're also on the slides if you wanted to click through from there. But I would recommend watching each of the videos that go with each of the case studies. Maybe pause this video, go watch that, and then come back so that we can talk about each of those individuals. But I find those videos are a really nice way to summarize sort of these individuals who have been affected by different kinds of brain damage, and then also getting to see how that affects their behavior going forward. So the first of our case studies is an individual named Clive Wearing. And so Clive Wearing was a British musician and composer, and his central nervous system was attacked by a virus. And the major point of damage that we care about is that there was extensive damage to his hippocampus. And after this damage occurred, he started having issues with his memory. Specifically, he has both anterograde and retrograde amnesia. Now, if you've watched the video, you might have noticed that while he does have retrograde amnesia, there are some things, some facts, some bits of information that he can retain. But for the most part, he has quite a bit of a blank for his memories of the past. He does recognize who his wife is. He does recognize a few individuals, but not many. So we're going to call it retrograde amnesia, even though it isn't entirely, or it isn't full retrograde amnesia. He also has anterograde amnesia, which means he can't form new memories. So this means that he has very little recall of the past, and he can't make new memories, so he can only exist in the present. So he only has his immediate memory. And you can see that in the conversations that he's having with his wife in the video, where as soon as he finishes a sentence, as soon as something leaves his immediate memory, it's lost forever. And he sort of can't figure out what they were talking about. He loses that information very quickly. And from what we know about our immediate memory, we could assume that he can hold on to about 7 digits of information or so, plus or minus 2, and that he can only remember things for about 20 seconds, depending on how hard he's focusing on keeping those things in his current memory. Now, despite this lack of any kind of long-term memory storage, we actually see that Clive still has the ability to use and make procedural memories. So in the video, you see him playing piano. He still remembers how to do that. He can also learn to do new tasks, specifically if they involve behaviors. And so this is some of our sort of evidence that our procedural memories, the memories of how to do things, are stored differently and retrieved differently than our sort of long-term explicit memories. So things like our episodic memory and our semantic memories. They're going to be stored in different places. And we're going to see with Clive, and then again with our next case study, HM, that individuals who have issues with long-term memory can still learn new tasks that involve procedural memory. And so it gives us this idea that that procedural system is a separate system and it functions differently. So if we wanted to get our take-home message from looking at Clive Wearing, he's taught us that procedural memory and our declarative memory are different and separate systems. So they're stored in very different ways, possibly in different places. Our procedural memory doesn't require the hippocampus because individuals with damage to their hippocampus can still form and use procedural memory. But we do know that the hippocampus is important in the formation and retrieval of our semantic and episodic long-term memories, those declarative memories. So when that's damaged, they struggle to form and recall those kinds of memories. So it's a pretty nice summation of what we've learned from Clive Wearing. Our next case study is actually a bit more of a famous case study. This is one of those that you've probably heard of if you've done any kind of psychology or read anything up about memory in the past. So HM, also known, or I guess his full name was Henry Molaison, but he had a bilateral temporal lobectomy, which basically means that they removed some of the internal structures of his brain. So here we can compare a normal brain with the hippocampus present in the center there. And then in HM's brain, the hippocampus and some of the surrounding structures were removed. So the hippocampus, the amygdala, and some other nearby cortices were removed. And this was done to try and lessen the experience of epileptic seizures, because HM was suffering from regular seizures that were impairing his day-to-day function. And this procedure ended up being successful in that it lessened those seizures. He never had another seizure after that surgery. The problem was that the surgery also caused anterograde amnesia, meaning that he couldn't form any new memories. So from that point forward, he couldn't form new memories. He couldn't create new long-term memories. Now, HM was one of the most widely studied individuals. This is why it's such a famous case study, because thousands of doctors met with him, talked with him, studied him to sort of pick apart what was going on in his brain and how things were working. And so they've done numerous tests on intellectual ability, memory capacity, all those sorts of things. And so he had lots of normal scores on assessments of intellectual ability. If anything, stopping the epileptic seizures actually helped with his intelligence. So his short-term memory, his working memory, his word stores, all of that seemed to be fairly unaffected. And with HM, we actually saw that same quirk that we did with what was his name again? Clive Wearing, there we go, where he could form new procedural memories, even though he couldn't form new declarative long-term memories. So he was able to learn new tasks that involved bodily movements, even if he didn't remember doing the tasks. And the video that goes along with this case study actually gives you a full rundown of sort of HM's history and the people who studied him, as well as some of the techniques that they used to study this, including sort of tracing between lines by only looking in a mirror and seeing how he learned to do the procedure, even though he didn't remember having ever done the task, which is very, very interesting. But that ends up teaching us the same thing that we saw from our first case study, but also focuses in on the fact that our immediate memory doesn't require those medial temporal structures. So HM was missing more than just the hippocampus. There was damage to some surrounding areas, and that didn't seem to cause any issues with their immediate memory. And this also, again, highlights the fact that immediate memory and long-term memory are two different systems. They seem to work very differently. And that, again, these medial temporal structures, which include our hippocampus that we saw from before, are important in the formation of both semantic and episodic long-term memories. So more certain that, yes, the hippocampus is definitely involved, possibly some of the other surrounding structures, and we are for sure able to distinguish between our immediate memory and our long-term memory. Those are two different systems, but we also know that within long-term memory, our declarative long-term memories are stored differently and retrieved differently than those of our procedural memories. So two studies that support that evidence, so we're pretty confident in that portion of our model. And that lines up with what we've been talking about so far. Our third and final case study is an individual known only as KF. So I've looked and I can't figure out what this individual's full first name or full name is. They're just known as KF. But as I kind of mentioned in my preamble, this individual actually ends up giving us evidence that goes against the current model that we've been working with. So KF was in a motorcycle accident, and this accident damaged the left parietal occipital region. So if we look on the diagram over here, on the left side of the brain, it damaged the sort of overlap between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. And you might recall that our parietal lobe, especially on the left side, is involved in language and mathematics in a lot of individuals. So we sort of expect to see some issues with that part of the brain. The really interesting part that we ended up observing was that KF had damage to their sort of short-term or immediate memory. So if we've talked about our digit span as a record of how much information an individual can hold on to at a time, Where a normal digit span would be 7 plus or minus 2, KF had a digit span as short as 2. And sometimes, if there were enough other stressors going on, they might have a digit span of only 1. So it was almost impossible for them to perform any kind of mental mathematics because they couldn't hold enough information in their working memory in order to actually do the calculation. And then the weirdest part here is that despite this extensive damage to their immediate memory, KF had perfectly normally functioning long-term memory, which meant that they were able to recall events that had happened in the past, but most importantly, they were able to form new memories that would persist long into the future. And from our current model of memory of how we think things work, we have this idea that we go from our sensory memory to our immediate memory to our long-term memory, and information has to pass from step 1 to 2 to 3 in that order. But here, KF has suffered damage to the immediate memory. That second stage in the pathway is damaged. And yet, we still see fully functional information at step 3. So this tells us that instead of it being sort of a single pathway, maybe there's something else going on here. And this is the part that we can't necessarily agree on. In the field, there's lots of different proposals to try and make sense of this information. So anything from the fact that maybe the information from sensory memory gets split, and some goes to our short-term memory and some goes to the long-term memory. So instead of having a straight line, we more have like a Y shape. But there's a bunch of other complex potential explanations for this. So this is just to give us that idea that, yeah, we have a model that works for most situations, but we do have some evidence, and in particular this case study, that shows us that our model isn't going to be a perfect representation of what's happening. It's just our best guess, but we're going to continue using it because it fits with most situations. So this is more just making us aware that not everything fits perfectly. So our take home from KF is that long-term memory doesn't require functioning short-term or immediate memory in order to encode information, which, as I said, goes against our 3-component model, which is very, very interesting.